We're really plunging headlong now into our eschatology part of the course. At the end of last class, we started looking at a few key passages in regard to eschatology, and there's many passages in the Old Testament, but I am trying to draw your attention to certain ones that are especially relevant that Jesus and the New Testament writers refer to. So, we looked at the Psalm 110, which is very important because, as I mentioned, Psalm 110 is the most quoted passage from the Old Testament in the New Testament. And then I think we ended up in Daniel 7. We were looking at verses 13 to 14, where one like a son of man is presented before the Ancient of Days. That will come up several times in the New Testament. But one we really need to look at will be Daniel 9. What I have here up on the board ends up being one particular issue within the discussion of Daniel 9. But let's go there and look here. And again, one of the reasons why we need to look at Daniel 9 is because this is a passage that is brought up explicitly by the New Testament people. Jesus is going to refer to the abomination of desolation in Matthew 24. Paul's going to make reference to what's going on in this passage in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. The time period that we see within this passage is referred to in the book of Revelation, particularly when you get statements of 42 months. So, what I'll do here is... Okay. All right, so let's look at Daniel 9. Now, if you've done any study on Daniel 9, you know that this is a very, very highly disputed passage. And I think part of the reason why there's so much heat and intensity involved with explaining and defending this passage is because there's a lot at stake here. Because if there are certain things Daniel that is referring to here are still future from our standpoint, that has major significance for understanding that there may be a future tribulation still to come, a specific tribulation, and thus the book of Revelation, which refers to Daniel a lot, there would still be a lot of events that are still future from our standpoint. In Daniel chapter 9, you're probably familiar that you have that famous prayer at the beginning of the chapter. Daniel chapter 9 verse 2 says, "In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, observed in the books the number of the years which was revealed as the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet for the completion of the desolation of Jerusalem, namely 70 years." And so you end up having the captivity partly being related to the violation of the Sabbath rest for the land that was supposed to be taking place. Now, when you come to Daniel 9, it's verses 24 to 27 where you have this extremely important prophetic passage. I think there's something like within these verses, like 16 points of dispute. So some have said that this perhaps is the most disputed section because there's so many different people doing different things with this. And I think we do have to have a measure of humility. I think there's certain things that are easier to understand than others. So it's a passage that definitely we can devote a lot of time to studying to. And make sure I get my marker out here. And notice that it starts out, well, let me just go ahead and read some of this here. In Daniel 9, 24 to 27, it says, 70 weeks have been decreed for your people. And the weeks there can also be understood in the sense of sevens. So what I'll try to do when we're going through this, I'll try to point out the things that are contested and things that aren't contested. So the things that aren't contested by evangelicals will probably spend less time trying to prove because nobody's contesting that particular issue. When it talks about 70 weeks here, 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city. So these appear to be things that are related to Daniel's people, which I think contextually here, and when this is written, would have special reference to the people of Israel. And it also mentions the holy city. It seemed to me that Daniel and the people of that time would have understood the holy city to be in reference to Jerusalem. But it talks about 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city. Now the weeks there is literally sevens. So nobody's really contesting that what's being discussed here is 77s. And again, this appears to be a time period. There seems to be unanimity that the 77s that are being talked about here is in reference to years. So when it's talking about 70 weeks, I mean, you could say, well, is that in reference to, 77s of days, or is it in reference to years? Everybody's agreed. And when I talk about everybody here, I'm talking about those that are Bible believing, that are, those that trust the authority of the Word of God, would see the 70 weeks here as 77s as referring to a period of 490 years. So you end up having 77s, which is in reference to years. So it seems to be that we're being told that there's a 490-year period in regard to Daniel's people in the holy city. So 490 years in reference to your people and the holy city. And then what you have here is you have the mentioning of six things that are involved with this 490-year period. So what do we see here? What's going to be taking place in these 77s, or this 490 years, is one of them is to finish the transgression. So, some have pointed out here, with it being the transgression, that it, appears to be in regard to a specific sin or a specific rebellion. Many have taken that to be not just a general statement, but perhaps even having special relevance to Israel's sin against God. To finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. So you have 6 things that are mentioned here. Now, when it comes to these 6 things, there is some dispute as to what they are, at least on some of the things, and when they're going to be fulfilled. I think probably the biggest point of dispute in the last part of verse 24 is going to be in regard to when are those things fulfilled in their entirety. So now let me read on a little bit more, and then we'll come back and look at these 6 things. But it says in verse 25, "So you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. Then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with the flood. Even to the end there will be war, desolations are determined. And he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate." So notice that you're dealing here with this 490-year period. Another big picture issue that we may want to look at here now before we get into some of the more specifics. But notice some of the things that are mentioned here in regard to this period. It mentions that in verse 25, that there's, in the middle of the verse, that there's going to be 7 and 62 weeks. So it talks about a 7-week period. It talks about a 62-week period. And then it also talks about, at the end there being another week. Should be the 70th week. So, when you put this all together, in regard to years, it would be 490 years. The thing that's going to be really disputed, and this is where things get really hot when it comes to the debate and the discussion over the issue, is there... Well, first of all, when you put these two together, 7 and 62, when you put those together, it's talking about a 69-week period. So when we're talking about is there a gap between the 69th and the 70th week, we're assuming, putting these two together. The first 7 weeks seems to be in reference to, the the city and it being put together. Now, but the issue is going to come into play is there a gap here? Is there a gap between the 69th week and the 70th week of Daniel? And part of that will tie into what we were talking about in verse 24, because in verse 24, when you see those 6 things there, some people who are going to say, you're basically going to have 2 camps. One camp is going to say there's no gap between the 69th and the 70th week. And then you're going to have another camp that's going to say there is a gap. There is a gap between the 69th and the 70th week. And when we're talking about the 69th and the 70th week, when you're playing that out in regard to years, you would be saying that there's a difference between the first 483 years and the last 7-year period. The reason why I bring this up at this point is, let's just play this out. If you believe that everything in this 70-week period, or 490 years, because remember, altogether, 70 weeks equals 490 years. If you hold to this particular view, you're going to see everything in the Daniel passage already fulfilled. If you go more for this view, that there can be a gap between the 69th and the 70th week, you're going to say there are still certain things that are mentioned here that have not been fulfilled. Does that make sense? So this is really what it's going to come down to. Nobody, let's just say nobody in the debate, as I've qualified it, is contesting any of this. That it's 77s of years, that it's 490 years. The contesting is going to be whether there's a gap between the first 483 years and the last 7 years, or to put it another way, between the 69th week and the 70th week. Now, as we go back to verse 24, yes, man.
Number 2, and also believe that everything is fulfilled, like there is a gap, but the 70th week is already passed.
Yeah.
The first one, everything is fulfilled. The second
Yeah, there's going to be 2 different routes. Well, I would say technically yes. It's a yes and no sort of thing, because like some preterists are going to say it's already been fulfilled, but it's in AD 70. So in a sense, there's a little gap for them. The ironic thing is they're going to criticize others for holding to a larger gap, even though they're seeing a gap, because there's obviously 3 decades or so that are going until AD 70. So technically, without getting into all the theological stuff, you could hold to an AD 70 destruction with the gap and see it as all fulfilled from our standpoint. So thus, when you look at verse 24, depending on how you view this issue, you may come to different conclusions on the fulfillment of the 6 things that are talked about in verse 24. I think everybody is going to say that there are certain things related to Christ's first coming that are related to these things. The issue is going to be are all 6 of these things fulfilled entirely, as discussed here. So like when it talks about to finish, one of the first things here, to finish the transgression, some would say, like in the first camp here, they would say, hey, that's referring to, Christ came and, he died for sin. The other side is going to say, yes, that's true, but if this is also in regard to Daniel's people, it also may have a reference to Israel's sin being taken away from them at the time of their salvation. So some would say with to finish the transgression, that's already entirely been fulfilled. Others would say, no, the basis of that has been laid, but in regard to Israel and their sin being dealt with, that there's still a future aspect to that, like in Zechariah 12:10, when they look on him whom they've pierced and mourn for an only son. Now on the other one, on the second thing, it says, when it says to make atonement for iniquity, clearly that has reference to the death of Christ and his atonement. So there's atonement that is made. Now, when you get to these other things, to bring in everlasting righteousness, Has that been fulfilled? Like on that particular one, I would say the basis for righteousness has been laid with the death of Christ, but I don't think everlasting righteousness has been inaugurated. So like when I would look at that, I would say, okay, that has to be something that still has some sort of future aspect to it. When it talks about to seal up vision and prophecy, that also seems to indicate that any kind of supernatural visions and prophecies are wrapped up. They don't happen anymore. Now that intersects into other issues here, and perhaps even into some charismatic and cessationism issues here. I would say, even as a cessationist, one of the things that's given to the church, according to 1 Corinthians 12, are prophets. So I would say that you still end up having prophets that are continuing on in the early church. I also think it's true that in Joel chapter 2, that it predicts that in the last days for Israel, that there's also going to be dreams and visions and those sorts of things. So I actually think in the tribulation period that you may see the manifestation of those sorts of things again. So I technically usually haven't seen the vision and prophecy as being totally fulfilled, by 36 or 40 AD. Yep. Yes.
Bringing in everlasting righteousness, some people just argue that as the millennial kingdom or the eternal state, or what it's going to be.
Those who would take it futuristically usually would see it as personally, I would see it as having relevance to both. But as far as the righteous kingdom of the Messiah, I think it would have reference for the millennium. Okay, now, and if you notice the last one here, to anoint the most holy place, you're getting into reference here to the temple. And of course, when you get into temple, you get into a lot of debate on just, there's a lot of people who just say because Jesus is the ultimate temple, there are no other temples. Which, as I've already told you, I think that's a false dichotomy. I think you can affirm Christ as true temple, but still acknowledge eschatological temples like Paul does in 2 Thessalonians 2 and John does in Revelation 11. So, if you're just going literally here, to anoint the most holy place, there appears to be a temple that needs to be anointed. A lot of premillennials would say this is being related to, Ezekiel's temple that would come in the future. But anyway, when I look at verse 24, I'm just saying from my viewpoint, I would say that there are significant aspects of these things that have been based on what Christ did at his first coming, particularly in regard to atonement, particularly in regard to dealing with sin. But what I say that the full implications of all these things have already been fulfilled, I would say no. I would say, there's still some of this still has to be played out in regard to Israel. Then when it comes to things like everlasting righteousness, vision and prophecy, and the anointing of the holy place, I think there's a futuristic aspect to that. So that'll be one of the things you have to decide for yourself when you're looking at that. Can you get all those things into a first century fulfillment, or there's some things that appear to be waiting? If in your mind you're saying, okay, I do agree, there's a lot of this stuff related to the first century, but I still see some of this as future, you're probably going to be tending more towards this second camp. Okay, now let's go to verse 25. So you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. So what we're getting here in verse 25 now is we're being given a starting point. You are to know and discern from that the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince. When you put it all together with the 7 and the 62, it appears that you're coming up with a 483-year period. I think when it's singling out there the 7 weeks there, I think that has reference in regard to the restoring. I think you're dealing with a couple things here: the restoring and the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the coming of the Messiah. So I think that first 7 weeks or 449 years has specific reference to the restoring and rebuilding of Jerusalem, and then the very end of that with the last 62 weeks in reference to Messiah. So it seems to be indicating here that there's a 483-year period from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. So let's just take this at a piece at a time. Well, do we know the dating of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem? There's some debate on this, and usually the debate's within a pretty short period of time. There's a fair number. I would probably say not unanimous, but the majority view is that Nehemiah 2 addresses this with Artaxerxes' decree. And if that's the case, it would be in 440 BC. Not everybody agrees on the 444 date, but I would say that's probably the majority view. So if that ends up being the case, then it's possible that you end up having the issuing of the decree beginning, in 444 BC with the decree. And then we know that there's going to be 7 and 62. I'm sorry, I keep making a mistake here. 7 and 62, which is really 69 when you put those together. First 7 in regard to the rebuilding, and the 62 in regard to Messiah the Prince. So, if that ends up being the case, then there appears to be saying that from 440 BC through these 69 weeks, you're going to end up having the Messiah. So you are to know and discern from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Which Harold Hoehner, now there's been several people that have done the chronology of this. The one that appears to be, it's not unchallenged, but the one that appears to be accepted by a lot of Christians is Harold Hoehner's, or just chronological aspects of the life of Christ. If you were just to, not do it now, but if you were just to Google Horner and Harold Hoehner and on the 70 weeks, you'd find all kinds of stuff on the internet dealing with his calculations and all that. I'm not going to go through all the, he is dealing with a 360-day-a-year model. He's taken into account the Jewish calendar and all these sorts of things. But it basically puts you out. He ends up coming up with Messiah coming in AD 33. As a matter of fact, I think he has it as March 30. March 30, AD 33. Now, let me tell you a point that there's a fair amount of consensus on, which would be of Bible-believing Christians, whether they're premillennial or amillennial or postmillennial, they all believe that first 69 weeks or 483 years zeroes in either at this particular time or really, really close. So it takes you up to Christ. Some have said, well, it's AD 26. And others say, okay, it's AD 30 or 32 or 33. But you're dealing with a pretty, I would just say, I mean, I'm a presuppositionalist, so I know it's a hard issue, not an intellectual issue, but I don't know how you could be an unbeliever after looking at this prophecy. Even if you want to do a late date for Daniel or whatever, I mean, that still doesn't, Christ is coming after, which I don't go for a late date for Daniel. But I'm just saying, this prophecy is really, really getting you really close to the coming of the time of Christ. Yep.
Explain the 62 weeks with reference to the Messiah. What is that? Because you're saying the first 7 weeks it took them to rebuild?
Yeah, so I think the first 7 weeks has specific reference to the rebuilding. And then I think, and again, I just want to appeal to consensus as an answer, but I'm saying there seems to be a fair amount of unanimity that the 7 has reference to the city. And then when it mentions 62, the 62 is coming on the heels of the 7. So that's where you get the 69.
I mean, what does it mean that the 62 has reference to the Messiah?
Well, what I would say is, like when you look in verse 25, it's talking about, there's 2 things that are being talked about. It's talking about a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, and it's talking about Messiah the Prince. So what I'm saying here, so that's what I'm linking. I'm saying I think you can take the 7 with the rebuilding and then the 62 with the Messiah, because it's talking about two different things. It's talking about the rebuilding and it's talking about the coming of the Messiah.
Practically, because they took seven weeks to rebuild Jerusalem. So it is practically 62 weeks. Were they like looking forward to the 62 weeks of the Messiah, or like, what is it? Like when those 62 weeks were actually happening?
Right.
What was going on with reference to the Messiah? Like, were they?
Well, I think the issue is just until it's coming. Yeah. So in other words, it's in reference to, that's when you can know that he's going to, until Messiah, until he appears. Yeah. So it's a timing issue. So one of them is in regard to the timing of the rebuilding, and the other is in regard to the timing of the coming of the Messiah. So anyway, before we get into the muck and the mire of the debate, let's just appreciate the accuracy of the prophecy, which is really narrowing in right in the adult life of Christ, which is totally amazing. So, like I said, when it comes to this date, this appears to be the majority view. Some take a little different view. You can read the kingdom through covenant view, and they got a little bit different date, but it still ends up being really close. Yep.
Do most people take the whatever date they're going to take for the latter stage, 33 AD?
Yeah.
Do they say that at the Christ's crucifixion, or do they say at the beginning of his adult ministry?
They're usually putting because it talks about the Messiah being cut off. And that's where we're going to get into verse 26. So this is going to have specific reference to Messiah's being cut off. So it does say, when you get to verse 26, then after the 62 weeks, and again, it's the 62, which is also following on the heels of the 7. It talks about the Messiah will be cut off. Here's a point of, let's appreciate all the points where we agree, which is going to be, all Christians are acknowledging here that this is in reference to Jesus' death, his being cut off. So, it's the Messiah, he will be cut off. And notice, and have nothing. I mean, the Messiah, the King of Israel, comes, and he deserves people's praise and embracement, and they cut him off and he has nothing, which is true in lieu of the crucifixion. Of course, we know Christ is going to be exalted, he's going to be raised, he's going to be ascended, he's going to be at the right hand of the Father, he's going to have all authority under heaven and earth. But there is a sense in which he has nothing. Okay, so that's I think everybody's agreeing here that Daniel is predicting the Messiah's death. Messiah's death in the AD 33, or close, as far as the date goes. So everybody's agreeing that at the end of the 69th week, which is 483 years, Jesus, the Messiah, died. Okay? There's a fair amount of agreement on that particular point. Now in lieu of the two camps that we put up here, the big question now is, what do you do with the 70th week? What do you do with the 70th week? I think you're going to see, so we'll put up here, what about the 70th week? What about, that final 7 years? Which, by the way, this is an important point. Were these calculations in these years literal? Everybody admits that. The first 69 years were literal. And perhaps, if Honer's right, literal to the day. Because in Honer's calculation, he has March AD 33 as the day of the triumphal entry. Now again, I'm not saying there's no dispute on that, because some people have a little bit different within here. But Honer, I'm just letting you be aware that Honer, in Honer's calculations, he actually has that as being the day of the triumphal entry, which without even getting to Daniel's 70th week, I've always viewed that as the official presentation of the king and the kingdom to Israel. If you buy into this, which I personally do, although I'm not dogmatic on it, I mean, it could be wrong, although I do personally think that there's a good chance that that's right. That may add significance to Luke, if you look at Luke 19. Now, I'm not gonna die on this hill, okay? I'm just letting you know a possibility, something that I think is possible. Because on the day of the triumphal entry, when he's approaching Jerusalem, and this is only in Luke's account, but this is the day of the triumphal entry, and if Honer's right, this would be March 30th, AD 33. In verse 41, it says, when he approached Jerusalem, he saw the city and wept over it, saying, if you had known in this day even you, the things which make for peace, but now they have been hidden from your eyes. So notice he's talking about things which make for peace. I think that's more than just spiritual salvation, because if you read the rest of the passage, it talks about judgment to Jerusalem and Israel, literal physical destruction that's going to come because they didn't believe. So if there could be physical, catastrophic consequences for Jerusalem for unbelief, I believe there could have been peace for belief. So anyway, perhaps a hint to Daniel 9, can't be sure, but I think it's possible. All right, so let's go back to Daniel. Okay, so actually I need to give you the different views. So I think what you're going to end up having here, what about the 70th week? What happens? One of the views is going to be there's no gap. There's no gap. Yeah, you end up having the 70th week ends around AD 36 or 37, or some would even stretch it out to 40. And part of the reason why I'm given this date here is because it'll say in verse 27 that he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. Now what I just read there it's highly contested, but for those who would say that the week continues, some of them will say that the Messiah, that they will say that this is a reference to the Messiah, and when it talks about in the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrificing grain offerings, they would say that's a reference to his death. So for those who would hold this view, they would say that the death takes place in the middle of the week, which is 3.5 years, so there would still need to be another 3.5 years to play out. So some would end up saying is if you just let the clock run, it's going to get you to it's going to push you into the further into the 30s. Does that make sense? I'm not asking you to agree with that because I don't agree with it, but yeah.
Would that put his coming or his anointing at possibly his baptism then, versus his death?
Well, I think some would end up saying, yeah. For those that would argue that view, if you take that view, you have to argue all of verse 24 has been fulfilled. Those 6 things. So I think when it comes to the anointing of the most holy place, they would see that as Jesus' true temple, as Messiah, he fulfills that. Not a literal temple.
I meant like at the end of the 69 weeks,
Yeah.
start, the Messiah's here.
Yeah.
Maybe his baptism, because then it seems to be like, in his ministry about 3.5 years.
Yeah. But the thing everybody's agreeing on is that he's cut off at the middle. So I think there are some that may link the significance of that, but whatever takes place before, the one thing everybody's agreeing on is in the middle of the week. That gives you that, which is after, right? But you're talking about as far as how that's fulfilled.
69 would put you at the beginning of his ministry, and then the 3.5 years would put you.
Right. Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, the significance of his ministry, the years of his ministry before this. Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. You're right. I got you. Yeah.
Talks about holy place. Some translations have it, some don't. It just has, the holy.
The holy, yeah.
The most, the night, the most holy, at a holy place.
Yeah.
You know why there's some translations like.
Well, I don't know the translation issue. I would just say contextually either way, because it's in reference to the city. I think that the context is heavily in regard to that. Now, clearly, one of the ways that there's going to be a difference of views is some are going to say because Jesus is the Messiah in the true temple, he can fulfill this in the first century because of his person. Others would say, yes, Jesus is true temple, but there can still be an eschatological temple to come as well. So, but the thing you should focus on here with this particular view is some are going to say because there is no gap, the rest of the 3.5 weeks goes and expires, and some might even link it with the ministry of Paul. Some don't. Another view is that the 70th week expires with the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Which is often connected with the preterist. Well, not all. I mean, there's going to be some who believe it can be both and AD 70, and then something that's in the future as far as the predictions. But some are going to hold that the expiration of the 70th week is with the destruction in AD 70. Now, but when you do that, though, if Jesus is dying in the 30s or around there. This isn't another 3.5 years, isn't it? I mean, we're talking more like over 3 decades. So those who would hold this view, they've already admitted there's a gap. Right?
Between the cross and the destruction.
Right.
Yeah.
Between the cutting off at the midway of the 70th week, and then right. So one of the reasons why this is ironic is because the people that are usually in this camp who say the 70 weeks has already been fulfilled, they're usually mad at people who hold the view that there is a gap with the future coming, but they themselves have inserted a gap. Their gap is 30-something years. Our gap may be thousands of years, but still there's a gap. Yep.
Just with reference to the text, where is that gap? Is it after sanctuary in verse 26 then?
The gap between what? Between...
Like where you insert the gap, like for view number 2, or
Yeah.
like when you're reading the text here, that means there's a gap between sanctuary and then its end will come with the flood?
Yes.
Where-
So with this view, it would be the gap between the middle of the 70th and then the end of the 70th. Is that what you're asking about?
I guess I'm just trying to find it in the Bible itself, like where in the Bible are they seeing the gap? Like between verses 26 and 27?
With this particular view?
Yeah.
Because what they would say is well, let's put it in this way. All right, I'll erase this here now. If you're looking in regard to view 2, they're claiming that when it comes to the 1 week or the 7 years, those who hold view 2 are saying that in the middle of the 70th week, Jesus is cut off, which is probably in the 30s. And then they're claiming that the end of the 70th week is the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. So for that particular view too, the gap is going to be 30 or 33 and 70. So for them, this is their gap. This is the gap for view 2. Does that make sense? Is that what you were asking about?
Well, I'm just trying to tie it to the scripture. So they're
Okay.
so they're not taking a chronological sequence in verse 26 through 27.
I would say that they're not,
Okay.
because I don't think they're being
kind of
literal.
rearranging it the
Yeah.
way they want.
Yeah.
Okay.
One theologian called it shoehorn exegesis. where you're claiming you're being literal with it, but you're still not really being literal. Because this is an over 30-year period, right? So some are wanting to say, with this view too, that the 70-week prophecy was fulfilled in AD 70, but that doesn't fit. That doesn't fit with the chronology that's being presented. Remember that everybody's agreeing that the first 483 years was filled pretty much to the day. I mean, very, very literally. Now there's some who are saying, well, it's fulfilled literally, but it's, the last 3.5 years of Daniel is really from the 30s to 70. Does that make sense? Right.
I'm confused how they see Messiah being cut off at the 3.5 year mark. In verse 26, he's cut off after the 62 weeks.
Yeah. Which,
So,
yeah, I agree. When we go through my list, I'll show you that. Yeah, yeah. Because, yeah. Okay, good. I need help on that. Yeah, yeah. So basically, what I'm doing is I'm explaining their view more than I am trying to, at this point, tell you what I think is the right view. But I think that's one of the answers, is it's cut off after the. All right, let's go. Guess, and then we'll come to John. Go ahead.
So that just second view is am I correct in assuming that it's basically saying it's a continuous 69.5 weeks, and then the last three
Basically
gap, and then 3.5 years prior to 70 AD something triggers the clock again.
Not that it triggers the clock, but it's more like for them, the last 3.5 years is really 30 years. Because they're not going to say start the clock again, because as soon as they say that, they're saying they're admitting there's a gap. Because whenever you say stop the clock and then start the clock, now it's just a matter of time. Because the thing that both of these camps are very adamant on is that those who believe there is a gap between the 69th and 70 are wrong for inserting a gap. So these two camps do not want to admit that there's a gap. So thus the third view would be, I'll just put this up. Go ahead, John. I'm sorry.
I was just going to ask, I know we're probably going to talk about preterism more.
Yeah.
But isn't that, that's fundamental to preterism, number 2.
Right.
That's where it all begins, right?
Right.
So you can't be a preterist and not believe that.
Right.
And then as far as talking about the partial and full preterism,
Right.
so both camps would accept that, correct?
Right.
And then, I guess I've answered my own question, because I was thinking specifically.
Those are my favorite kind of question, by the way. Just kidding. Somebody's asking it, like, hey, I got it. No, go ahead.
I'm sorry, because I was thinking about R.C. Sproul and what he's written on this, and I know he believes that, but I kind of made him believe that, just in my own logic. So thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Good. All right. So to put up the third view, which is, I'll even separate it from the other two. There is a gap, and not only a gap, but an acknowledged one. It almost seems to me with verse 2 is they're inserting one, although they don't want to call it one, because you're basically calling 3.5 years 30 years. 30 years, 3.5 years. This particular view is saying it's teaching a principle of a gap, that there can actually be fulfillment with Christ's death in AD 30 or 33, and then later on, the 70th week can be fulfilled. So this one is openly acknowledging that there's a gap. We're going to pick up again with Daniel 9. We're going to really get into the good stuff now. By good stuff, I mean the real controversial. As I say this, there's no doubt you have to acknowledge that this is a very controversial and disputed passage. But personally, when I go through it, there are difficult issues, but it seems to me, I think, not to be so hard, where I don't think this is a passage where we just have to throw our hands up in the air and say we don't know. But let's go ahead and continue. So notice we left off in verse 26 where it talks about the Messiah being cut off. So we're all agreeing that's in reference to Christ's death, and it appears to be in the 30s. The Messiah will be cut off. Notice it says he has nothing, which again is shocking. The Messiah comes and has nothing. The Messiah is linked with the kingdom, has nothing, something's wrong, and it was, although God makes things right and restores things. But notice now here, when you get to the next part of verse 26, and the people of the prince who is to come. Okay, gotta stop here. The people of the prince who is to come. So there's a prince who is coming, and his people are going to do something. It doesn't say at this point the prince is doing something, but the people of the prince who is to come are doing something. So what are they going to do? The prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. So it appears to be the city, and the temple. And its end will come with the flood. Even to the end there will be war. Desolations are determined. So not only is there this destruction, but it's like wars and desolations continue to happen. Okay, the people of the prince who is to come. One of the keys here is, who is the prince to come? Heavily debated. Heavily debated. The people in these two camps are usually going to argue that view one, which would be, it's the Messiah. It's Jesus. Why? Well, some of them say, you have an antecedent here. Because in verse 25, it talks about Messiah the Prince. And you have the same word there for prince. You have the Nagid there mentioned. So it talks about Messiah the Prince, and then it talks about the people of the prince who is to come. So some are going to say the prince is Jesus the Messiah. The other view is that it's, an antichrist figure. It's an evil antichrist figure. Can you see how this is a pretty big deal in your interpretation of this passage? I mean, we're talking like the difference between Christ and the antichrist when it comes to the trajectory of this passage. So, and again, the main argument for this would be is, the antecedent is the Messiah. And thus with this view, if that's the case that the prince is the Messiah, who is the people of the prince? It's got to be the Jews. If it's a, well, this particular view is going to be the people of the prince is going to be those associated with the Roman Empire, or the Romans. And the reason why this particular view would say the people of the prince to come as the Romans would be because when it talks about what happens, the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. So now here is a point where I'm going to point to one of these camps where both sides are going to agree. Both sides are going to agree that this is the AD 70 destruction of Jerusalem. I would not to go back to the Luke 19 passage, but in that Luke 19:41-44, when Jesus said, "If you would have known in this day the things which make for peace," then he talks about the city being destroyed. Right after that, I think in verse 44, he talks about the city being leveled because you did not recognize the day of your visitation. So everybody's going to agree that the destruction of Jerusalem is AD 70. Okay, now if that's the case, if we're all agreeing, when it talks about there's going to be a destruction of the city and the sanctuary, and by the way, there was an utter destruction in AD 70. Notice who the blame is going to go depending on this view. If you take this particular view that the prince who is to come as Jesus, is the Messiah, and his people, which are the Jews, you're blaming the Jews for the destruction of their city. If you're taking this view that it's an antichrist figure, and that the people of the prince who come as the Romans, the people that are getting the blame for the destruction of Jerusalem are the Romans. Does that make sense? So, this is where I think this view has a better argument, because who's the one that destroyed the city? It was the Romans. The Romans destroyed the city. I think it's much more direct to say the Romans destroyed the city than to say, okay, well, it's because of the Jews. They were because they did what was wrong. Then it was the Romans because of them. So it's really the Jews. But anyway, just be aware of that there's, that's how that works out in that regard.
And then number 1 corresponds to number 2 over there on the right.
Number 1, yeah. These two views are going up into here. This particular view here is up here. Does that make sense?
And so preterists, because I read, they try to make the Jews look really guilty. That's why they're doing that. I use Eusebius and try to make them look like they deserved it in some ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it's talking about the people of the prince who is to come destroy the city. They have to have the Jews destroying the city. But the Romans destroyed it. To me, that's a big problem. You can say, well, it's because of the Jews that the Romans did it, but it's still the Romans that destroyed the city. So I already think that this view is having a pretty strong argument with the with the destruction, which I think helps explain who the prince who is to come is. So if the Romans, you can look at it this both ways. If it ends up being the Romans are the ones that have destroyed the city, this would probably make it not likely that this would be linked with the Jews and then the Messiah, who is a Jew. Now notice also that it talks about here, the prince who is to come, it talks about will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with the flood. Even to the end there will be war, desolations are determined. What I think is significant here is that it talks about, you have this destruction of the city and the sanctuary, and it talks about its end comes with the flood. But then it says, even to the end there will be war, desolations are determined. It almost seems like here that the destruction of the city in AD 70, that's not even all that there is. It's like there's a destruction, but then there's wars and desolations, which I would see as having implications through this gap. So not only is it destroyed, but it's like, that's been the history of Jerusalem, the times of the Gentiles. There's, what happened to Israel, all the bad stuff hasn't just been AD 70, it's been perpetual since then, which I think actually adds to the idea of a gap. Because not only are you having a destruction of the city, but these wars and desolations in regard to the people, which continue. Okay, now when you get to verse 27, he says, he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate. So notice that he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. So who's the he? Well, it's either got to be Messiah or some kind of Antichrist figure. Who's the he? If you take this particular view, what you're saying is perhaps I should have spaced this better, but this is the he, equals Messiah, and the covenant is the covenant of grace. With Christ's death, and the many equals the people of God. So let's play through view 1. He, again, that's not my view, I just want to be clear. With this view 1, he, remember, because they're saying the prince who is to come is the Messiah. He will make a firm covenant, which for them, now again, if you've had any kind of premillennial background, this is probably really foreign to you, because you're thinking, wait a minute, this is the Antichrist making a covenant with Israel, which is right. I'm just saying, so you may not be trained you're not even thinking in this regard about, but if you're taking the view 1, this is Messiah making a covenant of grace with the people of God, which obviously would contrast with the view that this is an Antichrist making a deceptive covenant with the many who are the people of Israel, because this is very Israel-centered at this point. So with this particular view down here, with this view 2, what you end up having here is the he equals Antichrist, and the covenant is a deceptive covenant with Israel. Okay, do you see the contrast there? That's a pretty big difference, isn't it? Notice, though, that the covenant is for 1 week, which is 7 years. Covenant of grace for 7 years. I think the 7 years would be a pretty good indicator. We're talking something more like this. This is a 7-year covenant. Okay, well, don't be so literal. Well, the first 69 weeks are literal. So I'm taking this 7th week as a literal covenant. I mean, it seems to me there's a 7-year covenant. Well, you're being too literal. You don't understand eschatological times have come, and this whole age is eschatological times. The first 69 weeks were literal. I'm taking the last week literal. So he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. So if you're taking view 1, what that would mean is, when it talks about, if you're taking view 1, that he will make a firm covenant with the many for a week, but in the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice, they would say that's Christ's death and his ultimate sacrifice, which puts an end to other sacrifices. So the stopping sacrifice would be Christ's death in the early AD 30s. If you're taking the other view, the Antichrist view, making a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, that would be the Antichrist taking over of Jerusalem and the temple and declaring himself to be God and putting an end to worship within the Jewish temple. So maybe I should put that up here since I'm putting the other. Is everybody good on this up here so far? I really needed a lot of board space today, didn't I? So, what happens in the middle of the week? View 1 says it's Jesus' death that ends, the need for other sacrifices. The second view would be, this is Antichrist, who, takes over the Jewish temple. This is where I do think 2 Thessalonians 2 will be really important when we get there. By the way, not only do I think that there's contextual indicators in here on what the right view is, but I think when you look at other scriptures, I think canonically that helps as well. But we'll get there. Okay, does everybody see the difference there? Something's happening in the middle of the week. It's either Jesus' death that ends the need for sacrifices, or the Antichrist takes over the Jewish temple. Historically, just to make the point, first of all, I do agree with Christ's death. The need for sacrifices ends. But there's no evidence that the sacrificial system stopped right after that. They still kept going. Of course, in AD 70, that would end with the destruction, but that puts you outside the week. So in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abominations, or on the edge or the wing of abominations, will come one who makes desolate. So it seems to me an indication that this one here is bringing destruction. Notice the last part of the verse says, though, that even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed is poured out on the one who makes desolate. I think this really tips it over to the Antichrist view here. Because the one that's bringing the destruction himself is going to be destroyed. It seems to me to indicate that this is an Antichrist figure, not the Messiah. Okay, now in lieu of that, yeah.
So you said Antichrist figure there. Before, when you talked about the prince, you made a point to say Antichrist figure, and then it seemed like you were saying, now you're saying Antichrist. So is this like a pre kind of Antichrist character and then the actual Antichrist? Like, how are we to understand that?
No, the reason why I'm doing that is because I know this passage isn't calling him the Antichrist. In 1 John it will. So by calling an Antichrist figure, I'm being a little generic because it doesn't call him that. That's all that I'm meaning. I'm not denying any kind of typological connection with AD 70. I'm seeing this as straightforward prophecy of the Antichrist.
Okay. But the prince, though, isn't the actual Antichrist, because that's 70 AD.
No, this is still the Antichrist because it calls him, it's the people of the prince who is to come who destroy the city. It's not the prince at this point. Does everybody get that? When you go back to verse 26, it's the people of the prince who do the AD 70 destruction. It's not the prince. The prince does his stuff with verse 27.
So this notion that some of the Roman leadership is like representation of an Antichrist, that's not necessary.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessary. Okay. All right, Gus. And we're by the way, we're going to be going to that handout, the gap handout that like on Jewel, it's called Daniel 69th week or something like that. All right, go ahead, Gus.
In verse 26, where we'll have the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, we would designate that at the end of the 62 weeks and all the 69 basically weeks, but at the end of that gap. And then when we go into the but not for himself and the people of the prince, would you just say that's commentary on 70 AD then, of what's going to happen, but no relation to the week, and then the covenant with the Antichrist, or he will begin the 70th week?
I'm not sure I got all of it. I'm saying everything from verse 27 on is a commentary of the 70th week.
Okay. In 26, where it says, but not for himself, and the people of the prince, like, what are you relating that section to? Are you?
I would say Messiah cut off at the end of the 69th week.
Yeah, no, I got that.
But I would say that when it talks about the people of, I do think when it talks about the people of the prince who is to come destroying the city, and then the wars and desolations, I would say that's everything from AD 70. I would say that's still continuing. Yeah. That's part of my reason I think even for a gap is I think the end of verse 26 is even continuing now. Yep.
Just one orientation in verse 27. Halfway through it, there will come one who makes desolate. Is that a figure who comes after, and he will make a firm covenant? Is that the same person, or is that a different person?
I think it's the same person. It would come a little bit later in his ministry, but I still think it's the same person. Because notice what he does. Now, in verse 20, now I don't have my Bible up here, but in verse 27, he makes a firm covenant with the many. Well, the many are making a covenant because they think he's a good guy, right? I mean, you're making a covenant, hey. But then what's dramatic is in the middle of the week, he puts a stop to sacrificing grain offering. I mean, what Jew would want that? I mean, that's a negative thing. That's what we call it, a deceptive covenant. Because he's making a covenant, and then at the midpoint, we say that he breaks it. He does these evil things, and he brings desolation. But the one who brings the desolation himself is judged, according to the end of the verse. Okay, so let's go to my chart here. And I want to make some points here because this is really significant here. Like I said, you could do some searching on your own. You'll find some very passionate argumentation against there being a gap. But here's some reasons why I think it's actually not only likely but very probable. Well, first of all, even before you get into any points, there's two comings of Christ, right? And so there's already a big gap between the first coming and the second coming. We know that. And so, you could say, well, if you didn't have the New Testament or just look in the Old, you could say, where's this thousands of year gap between the Messiah coming and his reign? Well, as Revelations unfolded, we see that there is a gap. So now I mentioned some verses here. The Zechariah 9. I'm not going to go through all these right now, but Zechariah 9:9-10. Zechariah 9:9 is quoted in all the Gospels. It talks about the Messiah coming lowly on a donkey. But verse 10 talks about his rule from sea to sea when he ends war. and he rules over the nations. So I would say Zechariah 9:9 was first coming, Zechariah 9:10 is second coming. In Isaiah 9:6-7, it talks about a child will be born to us, a child is given. Then it talks about the government will be on his shoulders and he's going to rule over the nations. I would see that part as being second coming, the rule over the nations. Isaiah 61:1-2, you can actually link this with Luke 4, I think verse 16 and following, but it talks about the servant coming lowly and bringing, peace to people, but then it talks about, in Isaiah 61:2, it talks about the day of vengeance of our God. It talks about the day of the Lord. When Christ quotes this passage in Luke, he mentions the part about bringing the gospel humbly, but he doesn't mention the part about the day of the Lord, or the vengeance of our God. So all I'm just saying is, and these wouldn't be the only ones, there's all kinds of examples in Scripture where if you were to read that passage, like if before Christ came, if you read Zechariah 9:9-10, you wouldn't say, oh, okay, I get it. Verse 9 is that there's going to be a big, huge gap between 9 and 10, but we know that that's how it's played out. So my point here is if you believe there's a gap between the first and the second coming, you're already talking about gaps. Secondly, I would argue that it is true. Now, I'm not saying this point in and of itself proves it all, but the 70th week is singled out from the previous weeks. Now, you do have mention of a 7, then a 62, and then another 7, a 70th week. So you do have 3 periods that are mentioned. But this is where I think number 3 comes into play. Daniel 9:26 indicates that the Messiah is cut off after the 69th week, not at the end of the 69th or the beginning of the 70th. There's all kinds of people saying, there's this evidence for a gap? It does say in verse 2, I keep going to my Bible, I don't have it. After the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off. And so, like I said, I know again, not everybody goes with Honer's chronology, but if the triumphal entry is the end of the 69th week, he is cut off, pretty shortly thereafter. I would just even say, just on that point alone, because like I said, when you go on the internet and you read all kinds of stuff, people act like this is the dumbest idea that's ever been sprung. Gap between the 69th and the 70th, but it's like even here it's saying after the 69th week. Number 4, in addition to the cutting off of the Messiah, other events seem to take place between the 69th and 70th week, such as the destruction of Jerusalem and war and desolations in regard to Jerusalem. So there's a destruction, then it talks about wars and desolations. So I think there's even present applicability. So, when I look at this prophecy, I would say, obviously, the first 69 weeks have been fulfilled, and I think a 70th week is coming, but I think there's even indicators there of stuff going on in the middle, obviously Messiah being cut off, and then the wars and desolations and the destruction of the city. That all seems to be stuff going on in between. Number 5, while I do acknowledge that in Daniel 9:24, there are things strategically related to the first coming of Christ, there's certain things that have not been fulfilled yet. Israel's rebellion has not been reversed. Everlasting righteousness has not come yet. Vision and prophecy have not come to an end yet. And the holy place, temple, has not been anointed yet. Number 6, what is described for the 70th week has not been fulfilled yet. So, no individual that I'm aware of has made a 7-year covenant with Israel yet. Second thing, the destruction that occurs for the one who makes the 7-year covenant with Israel has not occurred yet. 7, the abomination of desolation that Jesus referred to in Matthew 24:15 was not fulfilled in the 3.5 years after his death. Let's look at Matthew 24. And by the way, I was actually hoping to get into the Olivet Discourse today. We'll get into that for sure next time. If you look at Matthew 24, now my whole discussion of the Olivet Discourse is coming next class, but I do want you to notice that in Matthew 24:15, when Jesus is discussing, the things pertaining to the questions of the apostles and their, in the end of the age, he does say in verse 15, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet. So there's no doubt here what we're referring to, right? the abomination of desolation spoken of through Daniel, standing in the holy place. Well, what's the holy place there? I mean, you're dealing with, the temple. Then he says in verse 16, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things that are in his house. And then he talks about in verse 21, you're going to have tribulation, etc. Remember the first view that, this view up here, remember we were talking about this? I mean, is anything like this fulfilled in the late 30s? I mean, you don't have the destruction of the temple until 80, 70. So even if you're, like I said, even if you're taking a preterist view, you're having a gap. So one of the reasons why I find this particularly significant, too, is when Jesus is discussing eschatological things, notice what he does. He doesn't appeal to transcendent eschatology. He doesn't say, I'm Jesus, the ultimate Israel, forget the details. It's all swallowed up in me. What does he say? He starts talking about Daniel. Remember what Daniel said? Daniel talked about an abomination of desolation. He talked about a standing in the holy place. He's talking about the temple. He's talking about the land of Judea. It seems to me Jesus is giving prophetic significance to those things. So, but back to my earlier point, going back to the sheet here, is I don't see what Jesus, because Jesus is referring to Daniel, and what Jesus talked about didn't occur in the 30s. And then number 8, writing in the latter half of the first century, and I'm being kind here because I think the evidence is heavily in favor of a 90s date, not a pre-AD 70. But just for sake of argument, let's even just open up the possibility, Book of Revelation was written, in the mid to late 60s. So writing in the latter half of the first century, John refers to a coming 42-month period in which an evil figure, the beast, does his evil ministry. Revelation 13:5. So I'll take you there. So if you look in Revelation 13:5. Contextually, it's talking about this beast figure. And by the way, when you read this, you see here that this beast is given authority from the dragon. So verse 4 says they worship the dragon because he gave his authority to the beast, and they worship the beast, saying, who is like the beast, and who is able to wage war with him? Verse 5, there was given to him a mouth speaking arrogant words and blasphemies, and authority to act for 42 months was given to him. Okay, now let's go back to Daniel's 70th week. That's how many years? How many is 1 week? 7 years. And how many years would be the middle in years? 3.5, and if you convert that to months, 42 months. So what I think it's interesting in Revelation here is you have this, and to me this also gives evidence that the prince who is to come is an antichrist, because you end up having this link here, because this is exactly the timetable of what Daniel's giving you in Daniel 9, right? That middle of the week, 3.5 years, 42 months, and there's this evil beast figure that's associated with it, doing evil things. So when we come back to here, but my main point with as you get to the end of this is this 42-month period comes from Daniel 9:27's time period. Middle of the 70th week corresponds to 42 months. Thus, John viewed the time period of Daniel 9:27 as future, right? So let's just put it this way. If the 70 weeks expires in the 30s, then why do we have somebody, an apostle later on under inspiration, talking about Daniel's time period in the future? He shouldn't be talking about it at all because it's already been fulfilled. And for sure, if he's writing in the 90s, it can't even be AD 70 because he's talking about something that's future. So, anyway, I would just submit to you, this particular passage, we need to be humble. We understand there's a lot of disputed points. But don't be buffaloed by people that make it sound like this whole scenario and the whole idea of a gap is like the dumbest thing you've ever heard. I actually think it's pretty well established. So, right, Thomas?
No, people would hold at least view 2. They say that Revelation, they view it as an early date, the writing of Revelation.
Yeah, because they have to get it all fulfilled. They have to get it fulfilled in AD 70, right? Which, by the way, that is something that we're going to be getting into shortly because we have to talk about preterism. But in order for preterism to be right, they have to have a pre-AD 70 date. What's ironic about that is the scholarship is heavily on the side of the 90s. And even for those, of the minority that have it before AD 70, they usually have it in 68 or 69, which still isn't earlier enough for the preterist view. They have to have it in 67 or before for these things to play out. All right, any other thoughts?
I mean, the no gap theory, I understand number 2.
Yeah.
But do people, there's people today that...
Yeah. There were some that they say they expire, like with Paul's ministry, but there's a sense in which you have to appreciate their honesty. To me, they're already admitting that there's a gap. That's the issue. Like I was reading, I won't give you the name of a guy, but a popular theologian, he was mocking the gap view and saying, where does it indicate in Daniel 9 that there's a 2,000-year gap? To which my response is, the 2,000-year part is kind of secondary. The issue is there a gap? Once you admit, a gap can be established, it could be 5 years or 4,000 years. So a lot of times people say, well, bring up the 2,000 figure as if that's a defeater. And I would just say to these people, you're already admitting there's a gap. So the real issue is how long is the gap? and then that gets into an issue of the actual fulfillment of these things that are talked about, and then the plausibility of the book of Revelation being written before AD 70. So, yeah, Mark.
What's your understanding of the flood in verse 26? Its end will come with a flood.
Yeah, I think that's indicating the rapidity or the quickness of it. The quickness. I don't think it's necessarily referring to a water flood, but I think it's referring to the quickness. These things happen very quickly, which is true historically. In regard to the AD 70 destruction. Now, why did I just spend a whole class on this? Because the more that I look at this issue, I really, really think that this particular issue is probably the dominant issue in how we're going to understand eschatology from this standpoint. Because, let's just put it out there. If there is no gap, then a lot of what we're going to be talking about can't be right. Because Revelation is going to be referring to Daniel all over the place. But if there is a gap, then all this sort of stuff that premillennialists usually see as being future, a coming tribulation, and then all the details within that becomes highly likely. So I've just become, kind of like in the covenant dispensationalism, I say, well, where's the real battle at? Like, if you were to win X, X battle, who would win? And that to me, it comes down to New Testament use of the Old. I think that's really the issue between covenant and dispensationalism. I think in the whole issue of the timing of Bible prophecy, the one who wins the Daniel debate is probably going to win. Because if you can establish there is a gap, then the stuff the premillennialists are talking about makes a lot of sense. If it's not the case, then there's going to be some real problems. But as I look at this, I'm pretty convinced there's a gap. Any other thoughts? Okay, let's introduce the Olivet Discourse. Let's do that. Yeah, sure.
In line 27, in the middle of the week, he'll put a stop, sacrifice, and grain offering. For the preterist, is that AD 70 in the middle of the week where Titus destroys the temple?
When they put a stop to the sacrifices, that'd still be the 30s. That's Christ's death.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, yeah,
Oh, okay.
yeah. That's come we got into that. Now you got to end up having a 30-year.
Because I've heard that interpretation where putting the end to the sacrifice and the grain offering referred to AD 70 and the destruction of the temple. And
So the middle, they would put it in the middle.
Put it in the middle. And I'm wondering.
Yeah, which would mean they'd have to be putting some kind of longer gap or week period. Either way, you're given a stretch.
I don't know if you've heard that, but I'm looking for that position. What happens to the other 3.5 years?
If AD 70 ends up being the 3.5?
Yeah, if AD 70 ends up being in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offerings.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've heard of that or.
Yeah, I'll have to look into that. That sounds like it could be one of the variations, but I'll have to appeal to looking into that later. Okay, the Matthew 24. Actually, I'll just go straight off of this here. Just so you know my methodology, guys, as we're addressing eschatology, I'm trying to look at the major passages, and then we'll look at the theological categories. Sometimes in the past I kind of did it the other way. It's like categories and then run into passages. You know, the thing is, when you guys are teaching in your pulpits, you're going to be working through passages, and so I'd rather do the theological implications stemming from the passages. But don't worry, we are going to get to categories. We're going to do comparisons of things. But the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24 and 25, Mark 13, Luke 21. That's where you find it. This is called the Olivet Discourse because Jesus gives his thoughts on his coming and the end of the age on the Mount of Olives. In fact, that was one of my favorite things about going to Israel last May, was going to the Mount of Olives and then looking in towards the east gate. You know what I'm talking about there, Bellin? And who else? Is there anybody else on the... Yeah, yes, others have been there, Tronway. Anyway, it just... that was one of the things I was thinking of, Matthew 24, standing on the Mount of Olives. But anyway, what follows is the longest response Jesus gives to any question asked to him in the Bible. It's all of Matthew 24 and 25. So it's pretty significant. A lot of times people say, what's the significance of eschatology and future things? The Bible gives it a lot of emphasis. Why have interest in the Olivet Discourse? Well, there's 5 chapters devoted to it in the New Testament. So very significant. We'll focus mostly on Matthew 24 and 25. We'll also delve into Luke 21, because Luke 21 actually has some information in it that Matthew 24 doesn't. We won't spend as much time on Mark 13. Not that we shouldn't or couldn't, but I think when you're looking at the Matthew and the Luke accounts, you're getting most of the information. So we are hearing about things to come from Jesus himself. About 1/4 of the Bible is prophecy, and this section is crucial for understanding prophecy. The historical setting, I think, is important. Matthew 23, 37 to 39, where Jesus says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her, how often I wanted to gather your children together the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. So notice where the blame is. The blame is on their unwillingness. Verse 38, I would say, as I see verse 38 as a prediction of AD 70. Just like Luke 19, 41, 43, and 44 was a prediction of AD 70. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. So I think that has implications for the temple. Verse 39. Now, one of the things I noticed with some other groups, oftentimes they emphasize verse 37 and 38, but they don't talk about verse 39. For I say to you, from now on, you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. I think that's a cry of a repentant Israel at their salvation. What's ironic about that is we know that they said that at the so-called triumphal entry, right? But it's almost like Jesus doesn't even acknowledge it because it wasn't real. But he does say, there is going to be a day in which you're going to say. So notice that there's going to be a time gap. I say to you, from now on, you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. I think Israel's crying out to the Messiah for salvation is linked with the second coming. I think Acts 3:19 to 21 makes that clear too. Repent and return so that your sins can be forgiven and that he will send the Messiah. Jesus has presented himself and his kingdom to Israel, but they had rejected him in the kingdom. So judgment is coming. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. But they will cry out one day in salvation. A broader contextual setting, that'll be something that we need to do too. We won't do it today because we don't have time, but we'll need to look at Zechariah 14, because Zechariah 14 talks about a siege of Jerusalem, the Lord defending Jerusalem, the establishment of the kingdom on the earth, and then the nations serving the Messiah. You have the temple and the startling statement. So as you begin Matthew 24, Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. So notice It's temple related. They're coming out from the temple. The disciples point out the temple. I think in one of the other Gospels they're pointing out how beautiful it is. And Jesus makes a startling statement. He said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another which will not be torn down." So he's talking about a destruction of the temple. Mark 13:3 tells us the following were present with Jesus: First Peter, James, John, and Andrew. Oh yeah, in Mark 13:1, the disciples were impressed with the temple. "Teacher, behold, what wonderful stones, what wonderful buildings." But Jesus knew of its upcoming doom. So here you have the question. As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, "Tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" So this is very important to look at here, because you could say there's three questions. Some people will say the last two are really combined into one. But notice, he talked about the destruction of the temple. So the question is, tell us when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming? When's your presence? When's your manifestation? Now again, remember, they're not thinking crucifixion at this time, right? I mean, we do. We look back and we say, okay, that's second coming. But at this particular time, this is basically a question, when are you going to manifest yourself as Messiah? And of the end of the age. So they're thinking, the end of the present age and then the Messianic kingdom.